Welcome back, young scholars. In this video, we will be discussing global migrations in the 19th century. So the big question you should be able to answer after watching this video is what changes occurred as a result of global migration in the 19th century. So global migration is going to increase significantly worldwide between 1750 and 1900. So this is in period 5 of AP World History. And you can see this graph here represents from about 1850 to about 1900, this just significant growth in aggregate total global migration and also broken down by region. So here we see transatlantic migration, many of those going to the United States. Here we have migration to Southeast Asia, a lot of those from China moving down to Southeast Asia, and then migration patterns across Northern Asia. So you can see the tremendous growth. Some students always ask about these dips, and this particular dip with respect to transatlantic migration right around 1914 to 1920 represents the World War I. Here we see another dip for World War II. So we can see it represented on this map, right? You can see the tremendous amount of migration, especially from Europe to North America. But this map also goes all the way back into period 4. So it also shows us the transatlantic slave trade, represented by red here, and also some other major migration patterns that maybe we think a little bit less about. So for example, Asian migration, especially Chinese migration to the west coast of the United States. And then maybe some others that you're even less familiar with. So for example, Indian migration to places like South Africa. So we can see this population statistics of South Africa, and we can see that the Indian population represented about almost 3% of the total population of South Africa. And the reason for that, obviously, is that India and South Africa were both British colonies, and so they had that in common. And so oftentimes you had people leaving India in order to find work in places like South Africa and other colonies. And so many of them moved to the eastern seaboard of South Africa. What allowed them to move so readily? So new modes of transportation, such as railroads and steamships, are going to allow more permanent and also periodic or seasonal migration. And so we've talked extensively about how railroads are transforming transportation in the industrial age, not only allowing people to be transported within a region, so for example, maybe being able to get from the interior of Africa out to the coast, where they can pick up a steamship and then migrate to other places around the world. Now when it comes to migration, you may have learned that there are some significant push and pull factors. The most important pull factor typically is the opportunity for work. So many migrants were from the lower classes. They were living in conditions of poverty, maybe famine, and the idea that they could go and seek out more work opportunities certainly lured a lot of migrants in this period. And you've probably studied this before if you've studied American history. So for example, the Chinese and the Irish, who both worked on the Transcontinental Railroad, sort of building it from different ends. The Chinese working on the Transcontinental Railroad, many of them from the western coast of the United States. The Irish building the railroad from the east, ultimately meeting in the middle. And so these were not certainly lucrative jobs, but they offered opportunities for these migrants at a time when maybe there weren't as many opportunities in their home country. So some migrants were pushed into moving by factors such as coerced labor systems. So as you look at this image, what do you think's happening here? So we have some laborers cutting down sugarcane. And remember, this is in the period post-abolition of slavery. So this is post-mid-1800s. And you have all these sugar plantations that still need folks to work to harvest the crops. And so in need of a low-cost labor source, many former colonial plantation owners turned to the cheapest available source of worldwide labor. And at the time, that was Indian indentured labor, because there was such poverty in various parts of India. And so you have this significant number of Indian laborers, indentured laborers, so leaving on an indentured contract, and so signing and agreeing to an indentured contract to work for a certain period of time. And then many of those folks then ended up staying. So for example, that is why we have in this particular map, which shows the percentage of Hindus worldwide, a significant portion of Hindus living in Guyana, which was a British colony. Oh, and by the way, India also a British colony. And then others like Suriname and French Guiana, Suriname a Dutch colony. In terms of the characteristics of the migrants, they tended to be male because most of the work they oftentimes tended to be doing was more physical labor. This, though, gave women more responsibilities and power ultimately at home. And so we can maybe make some connections between the increased growth of long-distance global migration and the rise of the women's rights movement, as women were carving out more power for themselves, oftentimes at home, as their husbands or fathers or brothers were away. So another major change as a result of the increase in global migration is the formation of diaspora communities or ethnic enclaves. So as migrants moved to new locations outside of their cultural base, they started to form neighborhoods and communities of people with those similar cultural characteristics. And so we see this in lots of different examples. You can see it here in Iowa with the Amana colonies, which are predominantly German. You see it in neighborhoods in Chicago and New York with Chinatown and Little Italy. So during this period of increased global migration, we see the formation of more diaspora communities. And oftentimes those communities then bring their unique cultural traditions, and then they start to spread those traditions outside of their ethnic enclaves. And this, of course, leads to one of our most favorite things in AP World History, syncretism, so the blending of various cultural traditions. So one of the major responses to increased immigration in the 19th century is the growth of racist attitudes towards migrants. So immigrants are going to face increasing racial and ethnic prejudice as states increasingly began to restrict the flow of immigration across borders. So if you recall from U.S. history, once you see this rise in Chinese immigration on the West Coast, you see a reaction by native peoples trying to exclude Chinese immigrants. And that leads to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was around 1880s, which was designed to prohibit Chinese laborers. And it was really the first act that was designed to target an ethnic group. But at its core was really just some racist attitudes towards non-whites. We also see that in Australia with something known as the White Australia policy, which was also designed to exclude primarily people of color, so Chinese, Southeast Asians, Indians who were increasingly moving to Australia. And there were a number of Australians who themselves were immigrants only a generation or two before, who were increasingly hostile towards those people with non-white European ancestors. So as a result of watching this video, you should be able to answer this big question about what changes occurred as a result of global migration in the 19th century. As always, thanks for watching.